In the golden age of American farming, when bigger meant better and power was everything, one machine arrived with promises so bold that farmers believed the future had finally come roaring into their fields. It was advertised as the most advanced tractor America had ever built, faster, smarter, stronger, packed with revolutionary engineering that was supposed to change agriculture forever. Commercials showed massive fields being conquered in record time, executives stood proudly beside gleaming machines at farm expos, and magazines called it the next evolution of farming technology. But behind the polished advertisements and confident speeches was a disaster waiting to unfold. The tractor looked unstoppable from the outside. Futuristic cab design, enormous horsepower, advanced hydraulic systems, cutting-edge electronics, and features farmers had never seen before. Dealers rushed to take orders, banks approved massive loans, and farmers across the Midwest traded reliable older machines for this expensive new marvel, believing it would secure their future for decades. For many families, buying one was the biggest financial gamble they had ever taken. At first, everything seemed perfect. The engine thundered across fields with unbelievable power, GPS systems guided perfect rows, and operators bragged that the machine felt like driving a spaceship compared to traditional tractors. Neighboring farmers gathered at fences just to watch it work. Some believed America had entered a new era of agriculture where technology would solve every problem. But then the breakdowns began. Small at first, strange warning lights flashing for no reason, electronic glitches shutting systems down, hydraulic failures in the middle of harvest. Farmers assumed early problems were normal for revolutionary machinery. Dealers promised software updates and quick repairs, yet with every passing week, the issues grew worse. Tractors costing hundreds of thousands of dollars suddenly died in the middle of fields with no explanation. Touchscreen systems froze during critical operations. Engines overheated under normal workloads. Transmission systems failed without warning, leaving farmers stranded miles from repair shops. Mechanics struggled because the tractor was so technologically complicated that even experienced technicians barely understood its systems. Farmers who had trusted the company found themselves waiting weeks for replacement parts while crops rotted in the fields. Some owners discovered that simple repairs required factory-authorized computers, meaning they couldn't even fix their own machines like previous generations had done for decades. What made the disaster even worse was timing. Farming operates on unforgiving seasons. Missing a planting window by even a few days can destroy profits for an entire year. Harvest delays can mean losing millions in crops. So when these tractors failed during peak season, the consequences were catastrophic. Farmers who had borrowed heavily to afford the machine suddenly faced repair bills, missed harvests, loan payments, and collapsing income all at once. Stories spread across rural America about farmers sleeping in their trucks beside broken tractors, desperately waiting for technicians who never arrived. Online forums exploded with anger. Videos appeared showing brand new machines being hauled away after only months of use. Some owners claimed the electronics were so unreliable they carried backup tractors just in case the advanced model failed again. Others said software updates sometimes created even bigger problems than the originals. The company continued insisting the tractor represented the future, but confidence was disappearing rapidly. Investigations later revealed the real problem wasn't just bad luck or isolated defects. It was a dangerous combination of corporate ambition, rushed engineering, and overconfidence in technology. Executives had been obsessed with beating competitors to market. Engineers reportedly warned that systems weren't fully tested, but deadlines mattered more than reliability. The company wanted to dominate the future of precision agriculture before rivals could catch up. They packed the tractor with experimental technology, believing innovation alone would guarantee success. Instead, complexity became its greatest weakness. Traditional tractors had survived for decades because farmers could repair them with basic tools and mechanical knowledge. This machine depended on sensors, computers, proprietary software, and fragile electronic systems vulnerable to dust, heat, vibration, and moisture, exactly the brutal conditions found on American farms. The tractor that was supposed to represent progress became a symbol of technological arrogance. Lawsuits soon followed. farmers accused the manufacturer of knowingly selling unreliable equipment. Some claimed dealerships were overwhelmed with complaints almost immediately after release. Journalists uncovered internal documents suggesting executives knew the machines were not ready for full-scale deployment. Angry customers organized protests demanding the right to repair their own equipment without factory restrictions. The controversy exploded nationwide and became part of a much larger debate about technology, corporate control, and the future of farming itself. Critics argued modern agricultural equipment had become too dependent on software and corporate ecosystems, turning independent farmers into helpless customers trapped by expensive service contracts. Meanwhile, competitors seized the opportunity, advertising simpler and more reliable alternatives. Sales collapsed. Dealerships struggled to resell used units because farmers no longer trusted the model. Some machines lost enormous value almost overnight, leaving owners financially ruined. Rural communities felt the impact as family farms, already operating on razor-thin margins, faced another devastating blow. Older farmers, the disaster confirmed their deepest fears about modern technology replacing reliability with unnecessary complexity. Many returned to decades-old tractors they trusted more than million-dollar machines. Yet despite the catastrophe, the story didn't end there. The failure forced the entire agricultural industry to confront uncomfortable truths. Manufacturers began investing more heavily in real-world durability testing. The right to repair movement gained massive public support. Farmers demanded equipment they could actually maintain themselves. Governments started examining whether companies had too much control over software-dependent machinery. Ironically, the tractor that failed so spectacularly may have changed farming forever, not because of its success, but because of its collapse. Today, abandoned units still sit rusting behind barns across America like monuments to a future that arrived too soon. To some, they are simply broken machines, but to others, they represent a warning about what happens when corporations chase innovation without understanding the people who depend on their products for survival. Because on American farms, machinery isn't just technology. It's livelihood, family legacy, and the thin line between survival and bankruptcy. And when the most advanced tractor in America failed, it didn't just break down in the fields. It shattered the trust of the very farmers it was built to serve. What followed the collapse of the most advanced tractor was not just a product failure, but a full-scale industry reckoning that rippled far beyond farms and dealerships. As lawsuits multiplied, the manufacturer attempted damage control with redesigned software patches, extended warranties, and public apologies that carefully avoided admitting design flaws. But by then, the reputation had already fractured beyond repair. Insurance companies began re-evaluating coverage for high-tech agricultural machinery, citing unpredictable downtime risks, while banks tightened lending rules for farmers attempting to finance similar equipment in the future. In courtrooms, internal emails and engineering reports began surfacing, revealing a pattern of ignored warnings, compressed testing schedules, and executive pressure to launch before the product was stable. These revelations transformed the case from a simple consumer dispute into a landmark example of corporate negligence in modern agricultural technology. Meanwhile, in rural communities, the emotional impact was just as severe as the financial one. Farmers who had trusted the machine felt not only betrayed, but exposed, as if their entire way of life had been used as a testing ground for experimental technology. Some families lost generational land after failing to recover from crop losses tied directly to equipment failure during critical planting and harvesting windows. Auction yards filled with nearly new tractors being sold for fractions of their purchase price, often bought back by the manufacturer or scrapped for parts that could not be reliably integrated into newer systems. Independent mechanics, once confident in repairing mechanical systems, found themselves excluded by encrypted software locks and proprietary diagnostic tools that required expensive licenses just to access basic functions. This created a new dependency chain where farmers could no longer fix what they owned, and every breakdown became a waiting game controlled by corporate service schedules. At the same time, rival companies quietly studied the disaster, not just as a cautionary tale, but as a strategic advantage, repositioning their marketing around simplicity, durability, and repairability rather than extreme technological ambition. Agricultural universities began publishing research criticizing the overdigitization of heavy farm equipment, warning that extreme automation without environmental resilience testing could destabilize food production systems. Policymakers in several states started discussing right-to-repair legislation specifically targeting agricultural machinery, aiming to restore mechanical independence to farmers who had become increasingly dependent on manufacturer-controlled systems. Inside the original company, leadership changes followed, with executives removed and engineering teams reorganized, but trust in the brand never fully recovered. Even attempted rebranding efforts failed because farmers remembered not just the machine, but the season it failed them. In coffee shops, farm auctions, and rural co-ops, stories of sudden breakdowns became part of local folklore, repeated as warnings to younger farmers about trusting marketing over proven reliability. Over time, the tractor itself became a symbol not of innovation, but of overreach, representing a moment when technology outpaced practicality and ambition eclipsed real-world conditions. Yet paradoxically, the disaster also accelerated long-term improvements in agricultural engineering. New generations of tractors that followed were deliberately designed with modular systems, allowing farmers to bypass software failures with manual overrides, and diagnostic systems were simplified to ensure that local technicians could perform repairs without corporate authorization. Even GPS and automation features were restructured to function as assistive tools rather than mandatory systems of operation. The industry learned, painfully and expensively, that resilience mattered more than complexity. Still, for many of the farmers who lived through that period, the lesson came too late. Some left farming entirely, unable to recover from the financial damage, while others rebuilt slowly with older equipment, choosing reliability over innovation. The abandoned fields where the tractors first failed became quiet reminders of that turning point in agricultural history, where faith in technology collided with the realities of soil, weather, and time. And in the end, the story of America's most advanced tractor was no longer about a machine at all, but about the fragile balance between progress and practicality, a balance that, once broken, reshaped an entire industry for decades to come. As the years passed after the initial collapse, the full scope of the tractor disaster expanded beyond agriculture and into broader discussions about industrial design, digital dependency, and corporate accountability. What had started as a single failed product gradually became a case study used in engineering schools, business courses, and policy debates to illustrate how complexity without field resilience can undermine even the most promising innovation. Analysts revisiting the timeline identified a series of cascading decisions that turned manageable technical risks into systemic failure. Early prototypes reportedly performed well in controlled environments, but real-world farm conditions, dust storms, muddy terrain, extreme heat, vibration over long operating hours, exposed weaknesses that laboratory testing had underestimated. Instead of scaling back features, developers continued adding layers of automation, believing software updates could compensate for physical limitations. This decision created a fragile architecture where minor faults triggered disproportionate system-wide failures. Once in the hands of thousands of farmers, these vulnerabilities multiplied rapidly, especially during peak agricultural seasons when downtime had the highest cost. The human impact remained the most enduring aspect of the story. Many farmers had not simply purchased a machine, they had invested their entire operational future into it. Loans tied to the equipment created financial pressure that intensified every breakdown. In some cases, families reported losing multiple harvest cycles in a single year due to repeated system failures. Rural newspapers documented emotional tolls that went beyond economics, frustration, exhaustion, and a growing sense of helplessness as farmers found themselves unable to control tools they once fully understood. The transition from mechanical systems to software-controlled machines had removed traditional skills from the equation, leaving operators dependent on remote diagnostics and factory intervention. When those systems failed, there was no fallback. Dealership networks also faced collapse in certain regions. Technicians trained in mechanical repair suddenly found themselves unable to service machines without proprietary software access. Service delays stretched from days to weeks, and in peak season, even longer. Some dealerships attempted to retrain staff in software diagnostics, but the learning curve was steep and constantly shifting due to ongoing firmware updates. As frustration grew, informal repair networks began to emerge among farmers, sharing undocumented methods to bypass certain restrictions or restore limited functionality, though these solutions were often temporary and sometimes voided warranties entirely. Meanwhile, legal and regulatory pressure intensified. Consumer protection groups argued that the tractor represented a turning point in digital ownership, where purchasing a machine no longer guaranteed the ability to fully control or repair it. Hearings examined whether manufacturers should be required to provide open access to diagnostic tools and repair documentation. The controversy contributed to broader legislative momentum, supporting agricultural right-to-repair frameworks in multiple jurisdictions. The debate was no longer just about one product, but about who ultimately controls the tools that sustain food production systems. Within the manufacturing industry, the fallout triggered a strategic shift. Competing companies that had initially pursued similar high-complexity designs began scaling back certain features in favor of durability and serviceability. Marketing language changed noticeably, with less emphasis on futuristic automation and more focus on uptime, mechanical redundancy, and field repair capability. Engineers reintroduced mechanical fail-safes that allowed basic operation even when electronic systems malfunctioned, reflecting a renewed appreciation for simplicity under harsh conditions. The lesson had become clear: innovation without survivability was not progress in agriculture. The original tractor line, once positioned as revolutionary, was eventually discontinued or heavily redesigned under new naming conventions, distancing future products from the legacy of failure. Yet the reputation lingered. In agricultural communities, the name itself became shorthand for overpromised technology and underdelivered reliability. Older farmers warned younger generations not to repeat the same mistake, to evaluate machines not by their advertised capabilities, but by their behavior under stress, season after season. Over time, however, the disaster also contributed indirectly to improvement. Modern agricultural equipment that followed incorporated lessons learned from that failure: modular components, simplified repair access, hybrid manual automated controls, and improved environmental testing standards. The industry gradually moved toward balancing digital intelligence with mechanical independence. The failure had effectively forced a recalibration of priorities. Ultimately, the tractor's story settled into a paradox. It was remembered both as one of the most ambitious engineering missteps in agricultural history and as a catalyst that reshaped the entire sector. Its downfall demonstrated that in environments where timing, reliability, and physical endurance determine survival, complexity alone is not enough. The fields it once failed in became part of its legacy, not as proof of innovation, but as a reminder that technology must adapt to reality, not the other way around. In the final phase of the tractor's downfall, the consequences extended even into global supply chains and agricultural planning systems. Export partners who had initially placed orders based on early marketing campaigns began canceling contracts after hearing reports from domestic users. Warehouses filled with unsold units, and production lines that had once operated at full speed were scaled back or paused entirely. What was intended to be a flagship product for international dominance instead became a logistical burden, with storage, recall logistics, and component recovery costing the company millions in additional losses. Engineers working on successor models were instructed to rethink architecture from the ground up. But by then, the core challenge was no longer technical, it was trust. Trust had eroded in layers. First came the farmers, then the dealerships, then the financial institutions that had financed large-scale purchases. Finally, even internal teams began questioning whether the original design philosophy had misunderstood the environment it was meant to serve. Agricultural machinery does not operate in predictable conditions. It operates in uncertainty, shifting weather, uneven terrain, long hours, and delayed maintenance windows. The tractor's failure revealed a fundamental mismatch. It was engineered like a precision device, but expected to perform like a survival machine. As investigations concluded, a clearer picture emerged of how decisions cascaded into disaster. Internal development documents showed repeated conflicts between engineering teams advocating for stability and management pushing for feature expansion. One of the most critical turning points was the decision to integrate a fully centralized electronic control system that governed nearly every major function of the machine. This meant that a single software fault could cascade across steering, transmission, and hydraulic systems simultaneously. On paper, it offered seamless efficiency. In practice, it created a single point of failure that could immobilize an entire machine in seconds. Field reports later confirmed this pattern. Farmers described situations where minor sensor malfunctions escalated into complete shutdowns, often during high-load operations such as harvesting or plowing. Unlike traditional mechanical tractors that degraded gradually, this system tended to fail abruptly, offering little warning and no partial functionality. That unpredictability became one of the most damaging aspects of its reputation. By the time redesigned versions reached the market, they carried fewer advanced features and more mechanical redundancies. But the original failure had already reshaped perception. Competitors used the incident as an example in their own marketing, emphasizing proven reliability and field-tested durability as direct contrasts. Agricultural trade shows shifted tone as well, with buyers asking fewer questions about peak performance and more about repair time, downtime history, and service accessibility. On the ground, the cultural impact lingered longer than the financial one. In farming communities, the story became part of a broader cautionary narrative about technological dependency. Older operators passed down the lesson that machinery should be understood, not just used, repairable, not just replaceable, and transparent, not locked behind digital systems. Some farmers began maintaining hybrid fleets, older mechanical tractors for critical tasks and newer machines only for non-essential efficiency work. Even education systems in agricultural engineering adapted. Curriculum began to include case studies based on the tractor's failure, focusing on systems engineering, environmental stress testing, and human-machine interaction under real-world constraints. Students were taught that innovation without operational resilience creates fragile systems, no matter how advanced they appear in controlled environments. Years later, the company behind the tractor attempted a symbolic reset. New product lines were introduced under different branding, with marketing focused on collaboration with farmers rather than technological dominance over farming. Engineers publicly acknowledged that earlier assumptions had overestimated the ability of software to replace mechanical simplicity. The language of revolution was replaced with reliability, serviceability, and field independence. Yet despite these efforts, the original machine remained a reference point, not because it was remembered for what it achieved, but for what it revealed. It exposed the limits of complexity in environments that demand endurance. It showed that the gap between laboratory performance and real-world survival can be wide enough to collapse even the most ambitious engineering vision. In the end, the tractor did not simply fail as a product. It failed as a philosophy, one that believed intelligence alone could overcome environment, maintenance, and human dependency. The fields it once entered with confidence became the same fields that defined its downfall. And long after the machines were removed, repaired, or scrapped, the lesson remained embedded in the industry. In agriculture, success is not measured by how advanced a machine can become, but by how long it can keep working when everything around it does not. In the final aftermath phase, the tractor's legacy began shifting from an industrial failure into a global reference point for how not to integrate automation into critical real-world systems. Governments reviewing agricultural modernization policies started comparing procurement standards against the incident, adding stricter requirements for field durability testing, independent repair access, and mandatory mechanical fallback modes in heavy machinery. What had once been marketed as a breakthrough product was now cited in regulatory discussions as an example of over-automated risk concentration, where too many essential functions depended on interconnected digital systems without sufficient physical redundancy. Insurance companies also permanently adjusted their risk models for high-tech farm equipment, increasing premiums and requiring additional documentation on system reliability before approving coverage for large-scale purchases. This created a ripple effect across manufacturers, forcing the entire industry to slow down its race toward full automation and instead adopt incremental, verifiable upgrades that could survive unpredictable environments. Inside the original company, restructuring efforts continued for years, but the deeper problem was cultural rather than technical. Internal audits revealed that decision-making had prioritized competitive marketing timelines over long-term field validation, leading to repeated suppression of engineering concerns that did not align with product launch goals. Several senior engineers left the company and were later hired by competitors specifically to avoid repeating the same architectural mistakes. Those who remained focused heavily on rebuilding credibility through simplified machine design, but the shadow of the failure persisted in every new release. In rural communities, the emotional memory of the disaster remained unusually strong because it had not just been a mechanical breakdown, but a disruption of livelihood cycles, planting seasons lost, harvests missed, debts accumulated, and land leases broken. Unlike typical product recalls that fade with replacements, this failure was tied to irreversible seasonal timing, meaning its consequences could not simply be repaired or refunded. Over time, stories from affected farmers became part of agricultural oral history, often shared during training sessions or co-op meetings as cautionary examples of trusting systems that cannot be manually overridden. Some describe the experience as the moment farming shifted from a skill-based profession to a dependency-based operation, where control moved away from the operator and into remote diagnostic networks. That perception alone reshaped purchasing behavior for a generation. Meanwhile, academic researchers studying the case began categorizing it alongside other major industrial missteps in automation history, focusing on a central theme: the danger of replacing resilience with complexity in environments where failure has immediate physical consequences. The tractor became a case study not because it was uniquely flawed, but because it represented a tipping point where multiple trends converged: aggressive digitization, corporate competition, reduced testing cycles, and increasing separation between designers and end users. In later years, when next-generation agricultural machines finally stabilized into more balanced hybrid systems, many of their design principles directly contradicted the original philosophy that had produced the failure. Engineers reintroduced manual override levers, simplified control interfaces, and even physical diagnostic ports that allowed independent mechanics to access core systems without encrypted barriers. These changes were not marketed as innovation, but as restoration of control. Interestingly, parts of the failed tractor's technology were not entirely discarded. Certain sensor systems and GPS mapping features were salvaged and refined, proving that the problem had not been advanced technology itself, but its unchecked integration without environmental adaptation. The industry gradually separated useful automation from critical dependency automation, a distinction that became foundational in modern agricultural engineering standards. Financially, the company behind the tractor eventually recovered through diversification, but it never regained the symbolic leadership it once held in the agricultural sector. Its competitors, having learned from the collapse, positioned themselves as guardians of reliability rather than pioneers of disruption. Even decades later, trade publications still reference the incident whenever discussing over-engineering in heavy machinery design, treating it as a permanent benchmark for risk evaluation. Ultimately, the tractor's story evolved into something larger than a single product failure. It became a turning point in how industries define progress, shifting the conversation from what can be added to what must never fail. In the fields where it once broke down, newer machines now operate with quieter confidence, less ambitious perhaps, but far more dependable. And in that contrast lies the final conclusion of the story. In environments where survival depends on timing, endurance, and repairability, the most advanced system is not the one with the most features, but the one that continues working when everything else stops.